hearts be acceptable to you this day, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. The text that Craig just read for us is from Eugene Peterson's The Message, chosen because the language that Peterson uses to interpret the gospel is so compelling. He talks about being baptized from the inside out. But this language is so different from the other versions of the Bible with which we're so familiar that I actually had to go back to some other texts and compare them to make sure I could see those connections. So I was looking at the New Revised Standard Version and the New International Version, the King James Version, and found that really interesting how different Peterson's interpretation is, but how on point it is for our lives. You know this text much more familiarly from reading it from Mark during the season of Advent. And while I was struggling, I'm kind of unsure where I was going to go with all of this because it was such a different interpretation, I heard this fantastic story the other day on NPR and realized how this story talked about being changed from the inside out. Jen White on 1A was interviewing Keith Corbin, the owner of a top LA restaurant. Corbin grew up in Watts in the 1980s and was raised by his grandma because both of his parents were drug addicts and not around to care for he and his siblings. Granny taught Keith about love and food and community because she would spend all day from 5 in the morning until supper time just working to prepare this amazing meal that she served up to anyone who came to the door, because that door was always open and space was always made around the table for whoever showed. Then Corbin goes on to talk about his later childhood, his early teen years, when he learned to cook crack at age 13. He says, interestingly, that he was born into this. He talks about families who have infrastructure, perhaps more familiar to us, families who have infrastructure of sending their kids off to college, and when they return, talking to their resources, the neighbor down the street who's an attorney who may know of an opening in his firm for the son who just graduated from law school. Or the banker who might know that there's an opening coming up for the child who just earned a business degree. That's the infrastructure that most of us know. But for Keith Corbin, growing up in Watts, the infrastructure his family understood was cooking drugs. He said that when his older brother, who'd been caring for him financially, could no longer do so because he was getting too old, he just passed on what he knew. He didn't know how to fill out a job application. He'd never done it. He passed on the way he knew to survive, to do drugs, to make your living by cooking crack. And so Corbin, who had this great sense of wanting to be the best of everything he did, approached cooking drugs with professionalism. Now, I know that sounds very discordant in your head, but that's his approach. And as he was doing this, because he grew up in a family without a father, like most of the young men in his neighborhood, they tried to figure out who they were. And what Corbin eventually found out who he was created to be, my language, not his, was someone who cared for people. He was a people person who wanted to care for everyone around him. And he was really big on accountability and discipline. And so even in a gang, he held people to accountability. He made sure that they followed the rules. As one might guess, for someone growing up with such a background, Corbin spent some time in prison. And when he got out in 2014, he was hired into a new restaurant in the neighborhood, and so got a job because he'd been working in the prison kitchen. He had a little experience doing that, got a job there. And after a day, they called him back and they said, "We actually have an opening for a manager. Would you like to take that on?" Well, of course, he'd like to be the manager, except that he was constantly being told what to do by the owners, and he hated being told what to do. And so he quit. He quit, but the owners wouldn't let him go. They followed him around and dragged him back in and kept him going because they saw something inside of him. And as Corbin says, eventually he grew comfortable with that which had been making him uncomfortable. Soon he was invited to move to the Bay Area to join the executive group of this restaurant chain, and eventually offered an opportunity to open his own restaurant back in his hometown in LA. And as he was ready to go and so excited and told everyone in the community that he would be the new owner, the investors got scared because, you see, he was a drug addict. He'd spent time in prison. They weren't sure they wanted to invest in him quite yet, so they told him they would make him the executive chef. Well, now Keith is angry all over again because this opportunity's been pulled back from him, and so he nearly quits again. But they give him all kinds of incentives to stay. They offer him commission. They offer him opportunities to act in the role of an owner even though he doesn't have that title. He says the best thing that happened to him was the pandemic. Because you remember in the beginning, all the restaurants closed. And so for the 50 days that his restaurant was closed, Keith went to rehab. He went to rehab, and when he came out and returned to the restaurant, he took total control. And the restaurant is now one of the top restaurants in the city of LA. He was made a co-owner. He now owns that restaurant. As I listened to this story, even though Corbin never mentioned faith, never mentioned God, I knew that he had been reshaped from the inside out. How else could one explain the changes in his life that took him from there to here, from the ghetto in Watts to prison to owning a successful restaurant? And you know, along the way, if you think about it, he met all of those emotions that we just talked about sitting on the steps. He was so angry when opportunities were taken from him, when he was not able to do what he wanted to do. He was disgusted by the changes that happened. He doesn't talk about being sad, but one could only imagine how sad that made him. He was fearful, and again, someone from the ghetto, someone who's been in prison, probably isn't going to talk about the fear, but you can only imagine to live in that kind of violent world, there had to be some fear. But what won out in the end is joy, the joy of achieving something that he never thought he would be able to do. At the end of the interview, he's asked by a listener if he were to start an after-school program at the middle school where he had been raised, what values would he bring? He said that he would want to teach the kids how to reshape their lives, how to take what they grew up with and make it into something different. He literally used the word reshaped. I hadn't even gotten to that point when I determined I wanted to use this story, and I was like, thank you. He created a network of support. He would teach the kids to do the same and to remain dedicated to their community in which they grew up. Reshaping previous things is exactly the message that we hear from Mark's gospel, because all of Jesus' ministry was just the beginning. The story continues even to today. God is still with us, still working through us. And the story of the good news continues in Keith Corbin and us, because God is not done with any of us. We are not yet fully what God has called us to be. God sent John the Baptist as a prophet to tell the truth and to predict what was to come. As theologian Caroline Lewis says, prophets like John are analyzers of the now for the sake of moving into a different future. As so often is the case, the good news in Mark happens in the middle of nowhere, not in the center of power, out in the desert, not in Jerusalem. And God always seems to offer the truth in the most unexpected of places. In the projects of Watts, not down the road in Malibu, in the aftermath of the pandemic, not when life is running along smoothly. John the Baptist's message challenges us because real action comes after him. He says, the star of this drama isn't me, I'm just a stagehand. Jesus' baptism will change you from the inside out. Baptism, my friends, is not our arrival. Rather, it confronts us to change and grow daily. God is constantly working to transform each of us. Like the psalmist says, God's mercies are new every morning because great is God's faithfulness. Challenging us is hard. We like that which is stable and familiar. New beginnings, however, mean constant change. But when we dare to risk moving out of our comfort zones like Keith Corbin did, the rewards that we find will be great. In a time when God is clearly birthing new opportunities for all of us in all parts of our lives, but particularly in the church, even when dread begins to fill us, we need to remember that God's mercies are indeed new every morning, that each day is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. And all of our emotions are part of that journey. But the star of the show, my friends, is joy when we trust God to lead us. My prayer is that we will work through all of those emotions so that we will find joy in the end. May it be so. Amen.